Well, welcome everybody to the Pardee School and Beyond the Headlines series. For those new to Pardee, and I think there are quite a lot of you who probably are, this is a series we do periodically on hot topics that happen. We sometimes arrange them at short notice, but we're honored, I think, to be the first of the season in the presence of our new Dean, Scott Taylor. So thank you, Scott, for being here. I think this is more than kind of beyond the headlines. That what we want to do today is kind of go beyond the tributes. The Queen has had numerous tributes paid, as you may have seen and heard and read, from people as diverse as Antonio Guterres, President Xi Jinping, President Putin, Elton John, and others. And that's not what we're here today to do. What we want to try and relate is the Queen's career, her period as head of state, sovereign, to the wider events of the world. We're a school of global studies, so we want to talk about effects on institutions, on the development of country relations, of course, newly independent states, decolonization, the digital era, what role the Queen played in major developments over 70 years, and of course 96 as a queen, as a member of the royal family. So I'll briefly introduce our panel. Thank you for coming. We have Professor Arianne Chernock, Professor of History at Boston University, Professor Erik Goldstein, who's Professor of History and International Relations here at the Pardee School, and Professor David Glovsky, a Professor of History too. So could I introduce Professor Chernock with her remarks? Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to have this great turnout here. Well, I've been thinking a lot about this subject over the past week, and I'm excited to gain a little distance from it at this point and begin to have a more kind of analytical bent, I guess, to my comments. I should also preface this by saying I have spent the past year during a sabbatical researching Queen Elizabeth's coronation. So I'm really immersed in 1953. So if you have any questions at the end, especially about the early part of her reign, I'd be thrilled to share some of my findings with all of you. So I've been assigned the task of speculating on what the Queen did to reinforce monarchy within Britain before we look outward to the empire and beyond. And I think what's clear to me, well, this is a challenging task, I have to say, because the Queen, to speak of the Queen as an agent at all is rather delicate business, because she revealed very little of herself over the course of her reign. In fact, much of her success we attribute to her silence in many ways. So to talk about what she did or didn't do is something we want to think about first and foremost. But it is clear to me, and it became very clear this past week, that much of her success did stem from personal qualities. She's been cited again and again as someone who was incredibly dedicated to service, who was selfless in her actions, who persevered, who had a strong sensibility, firm grasp of her role as a constitutional monarch, really understood that position well, and did a very good job staying in her lane and not intervening, not interfering in the day-to-day operations of government. And within Britain, the constitutional monarchical model that it has established, that is the hallmark of a successful sovereign. So those are qualities that are very much Elizabeth's. But I think two factors played a really key role in her success in reinforcing her role and her stature that were entirely beyond her control. And I want us to think about that as well. The first factor there would be her longevity, right? That was beyond her control. I mean, she had good genes, right? But she lived to 96. She reigned for 70 years. We talk about this again and again. That's not something that she did, right? That just happened. And this past week, I've been struck by how many Britons think of Elizabeth as a touch point, a connection to the past, a source of comfort because of her ability to link generations in Britain. In fact, if you were looking at footage of the queue that formed to see her lying in state David Beckham, of course, was famously on that queue. Why was he there? Because he said it's what his grandparents would have done. And I don't think we would hear someone say that, right, a famous footballer say that about every sovereign. So for him, it was a way of also thinking about his own family's past. We hear again and again this past week about the importance of 1940, the People's War in Britain, the fact that Elizabeth was a princess during that moment. She participated as an auto mechanic in the war. For many Britons, this is Britain's finest hour. And she was an immediate, very personal connection to that, well, some people say less complicated past. We can debate whether it is less complicated. The second factor that was entirely beyond her control, and this will be my final point, is that she was a woman. Now, I'm not trying to say women have it easier on the throne, but for the majority of the past 200 years, women have been on the throne when you factor in Victoria as well as Elizabeth. Through that process, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the monarchy in Britain has become a largely gendered institution. This is something I talk about a lot in my conversations with the media. In other words, many of the hallmarks of Elizabeth's reign we can discuss within a kind of feminized framework. The fact that she was a matriarch, motherly, that she was apolitical, or at least perceived as being apolitical, that she was emotional, sensitive. People talk about this. It's very much cast in these traditionally feminine or feminized terms. And this is, again, something that was entirely beyond her control. At the end of Victoria's reign, which I've thought a lot about as well, many political theorists, male political theorists at that time, said they'd wished that Britain would always have a female sovereign because they thought women were more pliable on the throne, more passive, and thus better suited to being constitutional monarchs. Now, I'm not saying anyone would actually come out and say that today, but I think implicitly that does shape some people's ideas about the sovereign and why it's a bit of an adjustment for Charles, or to think of this older man sitting on the throne. Now, I'm not trying to say because of her age and her gender that Charles is doomed. He's not, but he's going to have different challenges as a sovereign because he doesn't have that same generational tie that his mother had, and because we have to adjust now to a man being in this role that has become, I would say, largely feminized. I'll conclude by saying, though, that I think this is an opportunity, and let me just say briefly why. Now in Britain, we have a 47-year-old woman prime minister and a 73-year-old male king. Okay? This is a reversal often of what we kind of think of in terms of relationships between gender politics and power. And I invite all of us to think of this as an opportunity to think about power and politics more expansively, beyond gender, in ways that kind of challenge some of these received stereotypes and ideas about men and women's tendencies, right, or propensities. And so I'll be really curious to watch the next few years unfold in Britain as this reality kind of forces people to think beyond established norms and practices. So I'll conclude my comments there.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldstein.
And I'll pick up with that theme of constitutional monarchy and to sort of take an idea from a former colleague. Constitutional monarchy, and particularly in Britain, but constitutional monarchy generally, is a bit like the game of cricket. It looks bonkers, but it works. And that's actually one of the mysteries of it. Now, here, just to remind you, the Queen reigned, but she did not rule. Very limited power and authority. Again, just a reminder, in Britain, the role of head of state and head of government is divided between the monarch and the prime minister, unlike in the United States where the roles are combined, and therefore there's a sort of different dynamic that we often see and we sometimes forget. The Queen or the King has the right to be informed and consulted. That's sort of understood. And the Queen, I'll stick to Queen Elizabeth's reign, would sign or signify all legislation, but the monarchs in Britain don't really have a veto. They only have a theoretical veto. The last time they vetoed an act was in 1708. So I think that we can assume that's not active anymore. But the consultation role is where there's a significant role for the monarch. And as Arianne was pointing out, it's idiosyncratic to the individual. There are particular characteristics that come, and often the longer you're there, you become the received memory of the job. You're the memory bank for experience. Queen Elizabeth's first prime minister was Winston Churchill. The prime minister briefs the monarch, the queen, every week. It's usually on Wednesday evening. for about an hour. You know, if you have a tutorial every week on what's happening in politics over 70 years, you pretty much know it. And if you started with Winston Churchill explaining things to you, you know, eventually you sort of tend to know a bit more even than the prime ministers you're briefing. And so many prime ministers said how much they benefited from the consultations with the Queen. And also because it's one of those few moments where the prime minister can really talk about something where the conversation isn't going to get out and it's going to be secure. You have somebody knowledgeable to talk to. Being the leader is a lonely job, and this was one secure place where it could happen. It's also been pointed out that Elizabeth, and I hope Paul will talk about this, was the world's most experienced diplomat. But in many ways, she was eventually probably the most knowledgeable person about politics. She becomes the counselor. All the prime ministers, for all of the facts that they disagreed on other things, would agree of the benefit of meeting her. Now, just one example, though, of how the Queen might have influenced things. There was a crisis in British politics just at the beginning of this summer. Boris Johnson's leadership was imploding underneath him. He was losing support of his own party in Parliament. It looked like he would possibly be toppled. He determined the evening that the crisis really hit that he was going to fight on. He was going to force the leadership issue. It happened to be Wednesday. He had to go off for his audience with the Queen. They did it by Zoom, as it happened on that occasion. You know, they had their hours meeting. And he came back looking a bit deflated, and he had decided to resign. We don't know what happened in that hour. We never will. But clearly something in that conversation, perhaps just the question she asked him to elucidate what was happening, might have led to that conclusion. There was a role there of some sort that is, of course, one of those mysteries. All of the key cabinet members brief the monarch, brief the Queen, but also the heads of the military, every 6 months, the head of the intelligence services. She really was a receptacle of all of the knowledge of state. She doesn't need a security clearance. She was the ultimate authority. But also, just to point out, we were talking about her role in Britain, and since we did touch on this role, this is the role of global studies, global studies, she was a global monarch. At her death, she was the monarch of 14 countries. Now, her agents to do the job in those countries were governors general, and there were prime ministers in each of them, but she still was briefed all of the time by what was going on. So she had a role beyond just what was happening in London, and the Commonwealth, which she was a great advocate for, has actually had renewed life recently with countries now seeking to join it. Just in the last year, the last summit of the Commonwealth was in Rwanda, historically not anything to do with Britain, but which had sought to join, and Togo and other countries, Mozambique more recently, have joined. Just to again give a sense of the Queen's role in this constitutional monarchy, though, if you take a job in Britain in the government, you take a loyalty oath, as you do in the United States. In Britain, it's to the Queen or King, heirs and successors. In the US, it's to the Constitution. But what you're taking that oath to and taking it to the Crown in Britain isn't really to an individual. It's to the British Constitution and the values that are encapsulated there. And then just to remind you of one more of the mysteries of the British system. Britain has a constitution, but don't try to buy a copy of it. It's not written down. It's an unwritten constitution. So you have a country with a constitutional monarchy with an unwritten constitution. And on the surface, while it seems so unlikely, one of the chief reasons it's worked so effectively, at least over the last 70 years, was I think the role Queen Elizabeth played in making the machinery work in the very quiet way that she had of accomplishing things. But I'll stop there and turn over to our next.
Thank you. Professor Glovsky.
So I have the perhaps unenviable task of talking about the colonial legacy of the Queen, and I think as both Arianne and Erik pointed out, to talk about agency is a bit tricky. You know, what role did Queen Elizabeth actually play in any sort of colonial governance or in decolonization? But she did preside over decolonization in many parts of the empire. And so I want to talk specifically about the legacy of Queen Elizabeth among in former British colonies, and those who were colonized by the British who dealt with the, in many ways, the violence, the economic changes, and also the cultural colonialism of the British Empire over centuries, the vast majority of which preceded her life, but she was the inheritor of it in many ways. So it's kind of hard to talk about her legacy as as someone who wasn't, leading colonial policy, but was in many ways complicit and involved in the empire itself. She presided over the last years of centuries of both economic changes, if you're being generous, or destruction, if you want to be a little bit more cynical. I teach African history, so I see this. As soon as we're done with this, I'm going to go teach about issues of slavery and law in 19th century Ghana. So these are issues that are, in my teaching about Africa, are unavoidable. You can't discuss the relatively recent history of Africa without dealing with both colonialism itself and the legacy of colonialism. The role that colonial wealth and extraction played in enriching the British Empire and visibly in many of the symbols of the monarchy, the crown jewels themselves, are things that were taken from colonies like South Africa and India and still remain in British hands today. Much of the cultural wealth of Britain as well. If you go to the British Museum, you can see the entire empire present. And so all of this is part of the legacy of British imperialism, and through that is partially the legacy of the Queen. And Arianne, when you mentioned this sort of reckoning about now, after 70 years, it is very difficult to think about colonialism and have a real conversation about the legacy of British colonialism when the person who presided, whether or not she was the actor, but presided over this decolonization is still maintaining the exact same position she maintained 70 years before. So perhaps this will be a time to more reckon with and think about the end of colonialism, about the centuries of imperialism that preceded it. There hasn't really been any sort of formal apology from the monarchy for colonialism, with the one exception of an apology for the breaking of a 1840s treaty done with Maori people in New Zealand that promised land would not be taken from them, and then, of course, land was taken from them. But I also think it's important, Arianne, you mentioned World War II. World War II was more than just Britain's war. It was also the Empire's war. Hundreds of thousands of people from across the British Empire fought in the British military. The same is true in World War I. You see representation from the colonies as well. And so this is a way of thinking about Britain in a much more larger global context. So in many ways, the Queen was the figurehead and also a way to put a kind face on perhaps some unkind things, especially in the case of colonialism and imperialism, seen as like a paternalistic, or I guess maternalistic as the Queen may be, sort of a parent viewing their children, which is a very patronizing way to look at it, but often the ways in which these things are represented publicly. And so you've seen across the former British Empire a real thinking through in the past couple weeks about the legacy of the empire. And governments of former British colonies are perhaps walking a finer line about this. They're instituting periods of mourning and have put out some very kind declarations because they need to continue to work with the British government. They are trying to, to gain economically for their societies, and so they have to walk a finer line than perhaps most people are who don't necessarily see the relevance of the monarchy to their lives today. And I think you see different reactions in different places. In South Asia, and India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you cannot talk about the legacy of the Queen of the British Empire without talking about the legacy of the partition of South Asia into different states and the violence that came around that. In Britain's former Caribbean colonies, you really can't think about the crown without thinking about slavery and human trafficking and these sorts of things as well. So every part of the empire is dealing with this, or the former empire is dealing with this in their own ways. In South Africa, apartheid existed while Queen Elizabeth was in charge of the Commonwealth. Now, she was not, the person who was implementing this policy, but she was certainly the figurehead during it. And so these are all things that we have to sort of think about. There are a lot of people who have fond memories of the Queen in various ways, and I'll tell one brief anecdote and then sort of wrap up. So To give you an idea of how recent this is in many cases, the Queen and Prince Philip visited the Gambia in 1961. I do a lot of research in the Gambia. I've lived in the Gambia, and many people still remember this visit today. And in Gambia, as in many places in Africa, there are naming traditions about naming people. If someone's born during Ramadan, they get a particular name. If someone's born on a Monday, they might be named whatever the language in the area's name is for Monday. And so I've met many roughly 61-year-old people who are named Queen because they were born during the Queen's visit to Gambia. And now those people have people who've been named after them and after them. So when I was in Gambia in 2017, speaking with people, I met several babies who were named Queen because they were named after people who were born during Queen Elizabeth's visit to Gambia. And those people are still alive as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that I think in many ways the colonial legacy you can see most clearly today in Britain is just the demographics of Britain are much different than they were when Queen Elizabeth was coronated. It represents the empire in a lot of ways, perhaps on unequal footing, but you can see a much more diverse Britain today, in large part because of this colonial legacy. And I'm looking forward to hearing questions.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Before we open up for questions, we'll have plenty of time. I'd just like to maybe supplement some of the remarks from the point of view of a former British diplomat, and my boss was Her Majesty. I didn't belong to Tony Blair's or Margaret Thatcher's diplomatic service. I belonged to Her Majesty's because, of course, she's the head of state. I did get the opportunity of observing her and talking to her a few times, talking with her. We did a state visit when I was in Portugal, which was 4 days of being with her and her husband and the entourage. We took her to many different places in Portugal, so it was, of course, a logistical challenge, to put it mildly. We also included, particularly discussed with her, we took her to a communist-run city in Portugal. So we wanted to show the diversity of her. Portugal happened to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, ally of the Great Britain, dating from 1386, I think the Treaty of Windsor. But the Queen was very much concerned to show respect for different parts of Portuguese society, and of course giving 4 days, which would probably be unheard of for most world leaders today, to a country like Portugal was very much respected. So she was extremely interested in the world. And Erik mentioned the first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill's mother was American. Winston Churchill didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and one of his major works was the history of the English-speaking peoples. It wasn't the history of Great Britain. So he, I think, instilled in her, if she didn't have it already, the global perspectives on the world. When she heard she was going to be Queen, she was in Kenya visiting. She'd spent 2 years living in Malta when her husband was in the Royal Navy. And so Churchill, I'm sure, was a great influence in how to work with the rest of the world. And of course, Churchill had been all around the places as a young man: Cuba, Sudan, South Africa. He'd fought in wars. So he gave her, I think, a great global perspective. Erik's mentioned the connections with the military. And of course, the Queen's legacy is not entirely personal. It's the family she's built up, the new generations, which is important for youth. Her husband fought in the Second World War, naval officer. Her son, Prince Andrew, fought in the Falklands War, which happened to be when I was in Portugal. We met him coming up with the Royal Navy. Prince Hare has fought in Afghanistan. So the connections, the continuity with the military is very important. And I think genuinely she was interested in foreign leaders. She got to know a lot of them. Before she was Queen, she would probably be aware that people like Julius Nyerere were studying in the UK, Edinburgh University. Nehru, of course, studied at Harrow, the private school, prep school, and University of Cambridge. Indira Gandhi went to Oxford. Jomo Kenyatta, as well as studying in Moscow, studied in London. So she would have been well aware, and of course she got to know these people very well over many years going to the Commonwealth meetings. She, I think, was the one who insisted that the word Britain was dropped from the Commonwealth. It is now the Commonwealth. And Erik has mentioned that Mozambique and Cameroon and non-English speaking countries have joined. A couple of other points which I think are relevant to her legacy. She embraced broadcasting. She insisted with her husband that the coronation in 1953 was shown live, which was, quite a revolution. It may not seem like that to you, but gradually, and they employed and have employed very experienced public affairs, public diplomacy advisors to show the monarchy in action. Didn't mean she had to say a lot, but she had to be visible. She visited, of course, many parts of the UK regularly. She visited, I think, over 115 countries. But she embraced, gradually, the media and was always there. Of course, it was the major events because the media fed on her celebrity. And I think public diplomacy has been a major asset of what she'd done. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the definition of public diplomacy, but engaging with overseas publics, showing an interest in a society, not just engaging with overseas officials and foreign ministers, but public diplomacy is going out and showing an interest in the country, listening to what the country thinks of you, going to parts of a country when you visit which mean a lot to that country, and that she has shown herself a great public diplomacy asset. Now, public diplomacy can, of course, affect a country's tourism, investment, education. One of the things we did in the state visit to Portugal, we had the Royal Yacht Britannia. We used the event to promote investment in Britain. We had a day at sea for bankers and industrialists and so on, which, of course, is a part of the job of embassies to promote trade and investment. And she's coming, of course, the era of social media. And I think Arianne was saying some of the advantages she's had. Maybe she has had the advantage of not having cable news bombardment of opinionated news hostile to the royalty. Generally, the media and social media have been fairly favorable to the monarchy, and they've embraced that. And of course, the new generation, which she's encouraged, William and Catherine in particular, they have moved into the modern era. She's supported that. He now tweets about results of his favorite soccer team in England. The Queen would never have done that, but she's encouraged the generation to move forward with the times. So we very much welcome any questions. I don't know whether before we move to questions, anybody would like to supplement what's been said or comment? No? Very good.
I can just,
yes, go.
Let me just do two things. On the public diplomacy front, just for the visual bit, if you see the photos of the Queen, she's always in bright colored clothes. That's how she stands out in the photographs. That's part of the projection of imagery. She couldn't go around wearing a crown as in the old days, so this was one way of dealing it. For the colonial legacy, interestingly, because I think it's a very interesting point, this, and how it might cycle through. If any country has a long colonial legacy from England, it's Ireland. And a poll, public opinion poll done this June in the Republic of Ireland, showed the Queen as far more popular than any political figure in the Republic of Ireland. And I think that's a comment on her ability at projecting image in public diplomacy. So again, just an interesting one to watch.
Very good. So Elizabeth is, the other Elizabeth is holding the microphone. If anybody would like to ask questions.
There's no amplification. So I'm just holding the microphone. Okay, all right. It's just for show. Thank you for a great panel. Very fascinating. Really, really fascinating stuff. But to the point that you just raised, Professor Goldstein, and to the point about the colonial history, so much of it seems to be in terms of ties to the monarchy and an acceptance of Elizabeth as head of state in the remaining countries is personalized. It seems, I mean, that's certainly what we're hearing in the news, that this is very personalized, that it was out of respect for her. What happens, I mean, caused for some speculation on your part, but informed speculation about what happens now with some of these countries, especially in the Caribbean, that have already been agitating for Republican status, and what are the implications of any kind of exodus at this point? The Canadians have already apparently said they're staying, but other than that, what happens next?
Do you want to comment on?
Sure. I mean, I am hesitant to say there will be drastic change, but I certainly think, this process was already underway. Barbados left the Commonwealth quite recently. Jamaica is making a lot of noise about leaving the Commonwealth. I think particularly in the Caribbean, people are perhaps more predisposed to at least sever this one sort of official tie with Britain than others. I think for a lot of countries this is a very personal decision based on personal politics, based on who's in power at a given moment, who's interested in maintaining ties with, the symbolic elements of the Commonwealth are perhaps less important than the economic ties that it might encourage, and so for many countries this might be something they're not willing to risk. But I certainly think we're going to see at least the exodus of a few countries in the next several years. Some might kind of wait to feel it out. I'm a historian, so talking about the future is maybe not my level of comfort, but I think that some countries will probably try to wait and feel this out, and a couple might rush to get out.
As a Pardee historian, I'll weigh in. I was just in Canada over the weekend, and you're right, they've decided not to. But again, politics is domestic. They don't want to get rid of the monarchy, partly because they're next to a big republic, so that makes them different. The other thing is it would open up the whole language question in Canada as to who becomes the head of state. And this way they have an informal arrangement to alternate the language background of the leader, and it's just not worth going there for the political leadership. In Australia and New Zealand, again dealing with the older elements of the empire, Australia probably is more likely to drift towards a republic, which probably means New Zealand, to be different, will go the other way. Again, it will be, and it has nothing to do with the monarchy, it has to do with their national identity. But also, just for the benefit of the audience, dropping the monarch as a monarch in the country, of which there are 14 now, doesn't mean leaving the Commonwealth. That was an arrangement, again, that Britain made earlier on, whereas you can stay in the Commonwealth and be a republic. So that's sort of useful. So you don't lose the ties. And it is an informal club, but it is a networking group, and it's apparently useful to some extent.
Yes, I mean, just to comment on being head of state of Canada and Australia, I mean, head of state of Canada didn't necessarily mean that she was going to influence Canadian foreign policy or whatever. I mean, for instance, Pierre Trudeau was very close to Fidel Castro. The Queen never met Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was a casket bearer at Pierre Trudeau's funeral. I mean, those sorts of things Canada has often had, obviously a diverse country with maybe different foreign policy objectives. So it hasn't necessarily meant that to Canadians that you've had this kind of overbearing influence on the way the country goes. So any other points before we...
Well, I would, I guess, say to your point, I think there is more pressure now on the royal family to communicate a sense of kind of the multicultural heritage, tradition, and an outward-looking as opposed to insular approach to rule. So I think there's this grace period, a moment of kind of openness or receptivity, but the royal family is going to be, they're going to have to be extremely careful about the optics going forward, and pulling on a different version of British history that's always existed, but that has always been much more multicultural and outward-looking, and to make it seem sincere.
Tough line. We have at the back there. Oh, sorry, somebody with a hand up.
Thank you so much for those awesome comments. As you can tell from my accent, I'm British or half British. But I'm curious about obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the legacy vis-a-vis the sort of overseas colonies, and Professor Goldstein mentioned Ireland. But I was kind of curious about, you can talk about will countries in some of the former colonies give up the Queen's head of state, etc. But what about her legacy vis-a-vis the Union of Britain? Because to me, the Queen personally obviously had this attachment to an arguably mythic idea of Scotland, and she passed away in Scotland, which I think is sort of significant. But I think there is some talk about how her death might affect the attachment of Scotland and Northern Ireland, certainly, perhaps not Wales. So I'm just curious about what you think her legacy was as a British, not just an English monarch? And if I can ask historians to speculate on the future, whether there is any likelihood of change within the Union as a result of King Charles's ascension. Thank you.
I'll start at least. The imprint of the royal family, just physically, by the way, in Britain, is just always visible. I mean, I worked for a long time in a city which had the largest hospital in Western Europe. It was the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. It's actually named after her mother. But again, everywhere you see the king this, the queen that. And so there is a sort of visual reinforcement. It's been done partly on purpose, obviously, to do this. And so you see it in Scotland as well. The Scottish Nationalist Party, which is by far the dominant political force in Scotland, committed to independence for Scotland and wants a referendum on Scottish independence again, since Brexit at least, to revisit that issue. They've been trying to sort of tiptoe around the issue of the monarchy, but in the end, the clue is in the name of the country, and I think that is a part of the question. It's the United Kingdom, and those are the two bits, and it's the kingdom bit that's relevant. The Scottish nationalists often defer in saying they can keep the monarchy, but they want their independence. So I think they're trying to avoid getting tied up in the Republican issue. Northern Ireland is a whole set of other, as always, difficult issues for Britain. Wales has been interesting because there was some pushback to the announcement of William being made Prince of Wales, saying, no, well, this was always an imposed title by the English conquerors. And so there's also sort of a legacy issue there to an event from the 1300s, actually, but still that's coming back as, no, we don't need a prince. We need something else. So I think it's the removal of the Queen after so long is opening up a lot of issues that almost by politeness were left there, but they've been brewing underneath throughout that whole period as well.
I don't think I need that.
We're being recorded.
Yeah. Any rate, just a story from my past. Once talking to the head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, and I asked him, what's it like briefing the Queen? He says, how do you brief somebody who's known everybody in the last 50 years? And you'll tell her something, and she'll say, yeah, well, 20 years ago, they told me this, and it turned out to be false, you know. So it must have been for the prime ministers a real experience to come on and brief the Queen. The other aspect, I think, of the Queen's reign is, I've always been interested in German history, is reconciliation with Germany. The 1965 visit, which was an 11-day state visit, the longest state visit she had outside of the Commonwealth, I think did a lot in the sense of reconciliation, later on British entry into the European community, which Germany wanted to have. And finally, the issue to comment on is the kind of stability that a monarchy can give, that a republic can't give. The republics that were formed after World War I, to a large extent, failed. And they came from monarchies to some kind of democratic republic version, and subsequently they failed, and they went into not only dictatorship, but very, very brutal dictatorships. And I wonder if monarchy doesn't kind of ameliorate that to a large extent. Finally, on the issue of gender, someone I knew had some experience with Queen Beatrix of Holland, who told me she's really smart. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just a comment on that too. I mean, clearly, in the context of history, there are these continuing family connections. I mean, you mentioned Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria. There's a fascinating picture of Queen Victoria at Balmoral with Tsar Nicholas II, with her great-great-granddaughter. So the granddaughter of Queen Victoria married Tsar Nicholas II. So the Russians are very well aware of the Romanov connections, and of course the Scandinavian monarchies. They were all at the funeral. The King of Spain is effectively her nephew. And of course, Gibraltar, we don't always see eye to eye on that. They were on the opposite side in the Falklands. They supported Argentina. So the family connections, and to some extent her reinforcement of monarchy as a viable institution, I think is a valid point. We've seen several rulers, emirs in the Gulf region, who've changed their titles to king in recent years, because to some extent she, I think, has made the profession of Queen and King, not maybe respectable is the wrong word, but at least acceptable in the modern era. And I think that perhaps is a relevant point to her legacy. I don't know whether you would agree, Arianne.
I mean, we see that process you're describing already taking place under Queen Victoria, with sovereigns globally modeling themselves on her reign, which was seen as the most modern interpretation of monarchy for a post-revolutionary world. So I think that certainly continues.
Very good. Any more questions?
Every leader wanted to be photographed with the Queen. You know, they would go to great lengths to get that photo opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, she has, I mean, they've created, maybe it's just a feature of mass media attention, celebrity status, of course, for the family. I mean, it's not for her. Now, you can argue whether celebrity fame is justified. It is an astonishing fact to me, living here, to see all the American news channels, even Fox News, giving hours of live coverage to a country that they fought a war against and got rid of, over 200 years ago. And why is there that fascination? I mean, clearly there's respect for her, the way she's conducted herself and the continuity of meeting 14 US presidents and so on, and her interest in the world. But I don't know what people think. Celebrity status, is that a big part of her legacy, or is it something deeper? Any opinions? The world loves celebrities, and there are not many around. One of the things the Archbishop of Canterbury said yesterday at the funeral was leaders of the world don't normally attract that level of respect from their populations. Maybe they seldom realize one way or the other during their lifetimes, but it is an astonishing representation, what we've seen in the last few days, simply the number of people, including flying in from all over the world. And maybe it's difficult to explain what people felt. It is a sense of continuity, of stability, Joe was saying, that the monarchy can bring. But she did also, I think in many ways, define the role, because she refused, even in a situation like a referendum on losing Scotland, losing Balmoral, just think of that. She didn't speak in public intentionally about that one way or the other. So that has been, again, a reflection. Yes, Elizabeth?
One question I have concerns her, and I noticed this in the all of the pomp around her passing, how religious it was and how prominent the Church of England was. And I think we can assume that Queen Elizabeth was a believer, and that she saw this as a sacred mission that she was somehow embodying, and that it was something about the duty that she felt that she had to her subjects. And I don't know about Prince Charles's religious commitments or the religious commitments of the younger generations, but I'm just wondering if we lose that glue, her faith, what happens to the monarchy? I mean,
Well, Charles has actually been quite public about this. He wants to be defender of faith, not the faith. So he has pushed in a much more ecumenical direction. But that was not apparent yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So that was her funeral, not his, right? So I think it was her imprint in the way that the service was conducted.
And she organized it.
Mm-hmm.
She did the blueprint. It really was her funeral.
That's right. It was her vision for her funeral. Yes.
Yes, and
Pre-planned.
King Charles has, I think, indicated, of course, he has spoken out frequently on issues. Perhaps he regretted some of the times he has spoken out. But he's spoken out forcefully on Ukraine. He's spoken out, of course, on climate issues for many years and been associated with that as a global issue. Now, will he may well change a lot of the strategies. Will he broadcast essentially once a year to the nation, or will he have some fireside chats? All these sorts of things is up, and clearly he wants to put his imprint on. He's 73 years of age. So, he may not have 70 years on the throne. So that's one issue for him. But so he will want to, as has been said, build on the past, but also maybe recognize that more modern things need to be done. He wants to be seen and to be visible. And to, of course, he went through a rocky time with the British public. I mean, he was way down in opinion polls, if you follow those sorts of things. So he has, to some extent, rebuild his own trust with the country. But it's an interesting legacy, too, that Liz Truss, of course, who came in just, it's hard to believe, 2 weeks ago, her cabinet includes Kwasi Kwarteng, who is from a Ghanaian family, brilliant academic record. We have a foreign secretary whose mother's from Sierra Leone. We have a home secretary who comes from a Goan Kenyan family. And that it clearly is, I think, fair to be part of the Queen's legacy as well.
Thank you for the excellent presentation, by the way. I was wondering, so the Queen, as both like the royal figure for the United Kingdom and as a chief diplomat in a sense for the United Kingdom, do you think she should have took a more assertive role toward the Ukrainian crisis and other geopolitical events in the past decade or so? Do you think that if she took a more proactive stance toward Putin and his build-up toward the Ukrainian crisis happening today, do you think it could have avoided the situation? Could the situation have progressed in a different way? What are your thoughts on this?
Good.
The Queen had to follow the advice of her Prime Minister and her ministers. The old saying is, if the Queen was presented with her own death warrant by the cabinet, she would have to sign it. But the Queen would do symbolic things. So she appeared on a media with blue and yellow flowers around her. So she was signaling something. She would do things quietly that way, the way she was dressed or something. So she was indicating, and that was as far as really she could go politically. She was apolitical, but where she traveled to was, of course, guided by the government as well, and what they were thinking about at the time, and which visitors she received was also determined.
Yes, I mean, we don't know to the extent to which she communicates directly with other heads of state. I mean, she would be entitled to. Other monarchs, of course, have private conversations. She, maintains, of course, social relations. She became friendly with Michelle and Barack Obama, I think, on a personal basis. She invited the girls, when they weren't on an official visit, to come and ride round the grounds of Buckingham Palace. Barack Obama, I think, said that a couple of days ago. So she is clearly a great networker. She believes in relations. I think one of the people invited to her funeral was a cowboy from Wyoming, who they loved to talk horses. And that was her passion. Of course, the Americans did once send an ambassador, what was his name, Hare, I think?
Yes.
Whose main attribute was he was a horse breeder from Kentucky, I think. Yeah. So that was, of course, her passion. And she showed, of course, the human side too. She played, of course, the role of the mother or grandmother. She had 2 children in office, not too much maternity leave granted probably there. But so she was an ordinary person in the war, the Second War, when she was still a teenager. She insisted on signing up to be an auxiliary in sort of equivalent to a National Guard, and she learned to fix trucks. And so we used to joke during the state visit, if the cars break down, the best person to fix them is probably the Queen, because she could strip an engine. So she did show that, capacity. She didn't go to school. They wouldn't, she was homeschooled. She didn't go to university, unlike, of course, the future royals. But she did show that capacity to realize that, there was this human element. She needed to show you can't say the ordinariness, but she recognized that a lot of people would see her as elite. A lot of people in the former colonies and dependent territories would have resentments against Britain, and I think she recognized that. And she did, I think it's fair to say, befriend a lot of the key independence leaders.
I would just like to add, that's an interesting question that you asked. We sit up here and act as if we can identify what is political and what is not political. And I think that's been a convenient fiction over centuries in Britain, where in fact there's a lot more ambiguity there. And to Professor Goldstein's point, you know, in subtle ways she has intervened, even though we praise her for being this ideal constitutional monarch. She told the Scottish before their referendum to think carefully about their decision, hint, hint, right? And so there's wiggle room here. Some people have been saying, oh, King Charles will not be able to take up environmental issues in the way he is accustomed to now that he is king. But who gets to decide that environmental justice is political as opposed to something else, right? So we are constantly inventing. It's a product in many ways of the unwritten nature of the Constitution that Professor Goldstein was talking about. This is an evolving constitution, an evolving contract.
And when you have one person who has been in this role for 70 years, you start to think that whatever they have been doing is what that role is.
Exactly.
Yeah. And yeah, John? Yeah.
Yes. I just wanted to get your reaction to an observation, right? In the area of gender, if you look at what you would consider stereotypical male attributes, the ability to shoot a gun, the ability to cast a fly so you can catch a fish, stripping an engine, absolute nerves of steel, to the point when you are riding horseback to your trooping of the color and someone fires a gun at you, you don't necessarily know that blanks are being fired, but you continue on with the ceremony, right? Those are all things that, like, that's good macho behavior, right? Son and grandson deployed to the war zones, no hesitation whatsoever, you know, endorsing that decision that they must go, right? So in many ways, it seems to me that Queen Elizabeth represents like one of the most macho characters that we've known in our lifetime. Or am I totally off base?
I don't know if I'd
Look
call
at
her
you,
the most
Professor.
macho, but I mean, certainly she is in that tradition of Queen Elizabeth I, who said she had the heart and stomach of a king, right? Even if the body of a woman. And I think that helped her quite a bit. I was thinking more about the role that she inhabited, why it makes some people perhaps uncomfortable to think of King Charles. I don't know if any of you have seen the play King Charles III, which speculates on the possibilities of Charles actually fulfilling the roles or requirements of a constitutional sovereign. Will he be willing to not get involved in political issues? Like, would he hold himself back in a way we never saw people publicly question about Elizabeth? I was thinking there more about the institution than the individual. The monarch in Britain is very much akin to the American, well, to date, First Lady. And we are, you know, there will be a first gentleman at some point, but because that's kind of the division of power in Britain, I think we do tend to think of a lot of the ribbon cutting ceremonies and the charity work as being stereotypically, I'm not endorsing this position, but more stereotypically tasks that women have historically pursued or would be more comfortable doing, even if Elizabeth herself in these really important moments in her reign has demonstrated a steely resolve, right, or unflappable quality, right?
So any final questions before we round up our discussion with Erik? Yes, go ahead.
So as you mentioned that the Queen visited about 115 countries, if I remember correctly. So as you said, she was a great networker, but the British public itself was still speculative of Europe, and it is the rest of the world, as it has been for the last couple of centuries. With the change of the monarchy, do you think we might see a change in British attitudes towards the rest of Europe, Brexit, and all these like speculative aspects that the British people have had historically?
Anybody like to address that change on Brexit?
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's, of course, she goes back with her connections with Europe, and we've talked about the monarchies, but she learnt French. I mean, she's been, I think she's visited, you were saying, Erik, she's visited France more often than any other country?
Yes.
Is that right? So, I mean, she has certainly affection, interest in that area, but I mean, whether she thought the EU was, reducing Britain's sovereignty, I mean, who knows? But I mean, she's been, Churchill was a great proponent, of course, of European unity. I mean, he spoke in several speeches where he wanted the United States of Europe to come together. He was a great proponent of course, the Atlantic Charter between the US and UK, but he saw that Europe needed rebuild. So I would have thought that she saw the value of European unity clearly reflected through the EU, but I think as Erik says, it's very unlikely the monarchy would intrude on an issue like that. There's plenty of, you might say, blame to go around for how the decision was made, rightly or wrongly. It wasn't a very sensible move to have a referendum which could have been decided by 10 votes. I mean, for instance, when Montenegro separated from Serbia, they insisted, I think it was at least 55%. So there are all sorts of perhaps mistakes made in the whole process, and you know the legacy of Boris Johnson in achieving that. I just heard today that there's very unlikely to be a trade agreement, apparently, between the US and the UK, despite that was one of the things that Boris Johnson promised when Brexit would happen. So Brexit is still controversial, but I would very much doubt that the monarchy would get embroiled in it. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at future Beyond the Headlines events. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We'll have to talk about